Great. Well, welcome back to another episode of Legal Unicorns. I'm here in Johannesburg today, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by someone that I've got to know a little bit better over the last year, Derrick Kaufmann, Managing Partner of South Africa for Andersen's. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Rob. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking.
No, I'm really keen to, you are a well-known figure in the South African legal market.
If you say so.
And I wouldn't quite call you a veteran yet, but someone called me that the other day, and I was like, I'm not sure how
I've
to take
been called
that.
a lot of things. Veteran's not one yet. Yeah.
But I've had the pleasure of working with you, and I think only on a recruitment front, you and I speak very openly and honestly with each other. We understand the challenges that are being faced in the South African legal market, not just from a skill set perspective, but just in terms of you growing the business. But I think, and when I knew I was coming up, I was like, I really want to get Derrick on camera and chatting about your journey, but the journey of your firm as well, because you've got Andersen's is an unusual one, which is it's a global group, but you're obviously focused on. In many ways, it's kind of like a startup. So thanks again for joining. I won't keep you too long because I know that your time is money in the law game. But are you from Joburg originally?
I'm actually from Pretoria.
Okay, down the road.
Down the road. Grew up in Pretoria. I was at a boarding school in Pretoria. And it's basically it was like a convent for boys, I guess. And a Catholic boarding school there called Christian Brothers College. Matriculated there in the early 90s, and which was it was a transformative time for the country. So it was a really interesting time for me to go out into the world, and I went off to Wits to study law at Wits.
Okay.
So I did a BCom law at the time. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but the BCom was what I wanted to do, and that's how I ended up in Joburg.
Okay. Yeah. The greater Gauteng area has been your home.
It has, except for a small portion when I went to Stellenbosch to do my LLB. I did my LLB at Stellenbosch.
It was a good university I know well. That's where my wife went.
Oh, right.
And many of my friends. So you grew up in this part of the world, big sporting part of the world as well. I believe you played a bit of cricket.
Played a bit of cricket, not very well.
I don't know. I think you're better than me.
Yeah, I did play a bit of cricket. I had a really exciting sort of young cricketing fledgling career, which ended quite abruptly with a back injury. So I got a stress fracture in 1995. I was playing at the Wanderers at the time, and it sort of put an end to everything that I wanted to achieve. To be honest, I really wasn't good enough, Rob. But there were some really interesting people that I got to meet on the journey. So people like Alan da Costa or Mandy Yachad, who were senior players at Northerns. They were lawyers, and both of them were partners at Worksman's at the time.
Okay.
And that was the first sort of introduction I had to Worksman's, was sort of in that space. And
is that where you did your CA?
That's where I did my articles. I was a candidate attorney there. And so
did they help?
Well, actually, no, they didn't know of my application at all.
Oh, that's good.
But I did do some VAC work there at the time, and it was a really unique place. I was also lucky enough to have been offered articles at ENS. At the time, that was Edward Nathan Friedland. And I was bold and courageous enough to turn them down for Worksman's, and I was told by one of the partners at the time that I would never live this down. And in a way, I'm glad I didn't go, because I had such a really incredible time at Worksman's. It was brutal, I won't lie, but the training was world class.
This is it. I mean, I think that when we're at that stage, or certainly you're at that stage of your career, which is right at the beginning, we're basically kids. I know we have a lot of listeners who are in that age bracket now, but you really don't know a great deal. You have to go with your gut. You've worked really hard at school. You've achieved a lot in this, to a certain degree level in sports. You're having to look at, you're becoming a lawyer. If you've got the choice between two firms, you kind of have to choose. You go with your gut, don't you, most of the time?
Yeah, you do. And the this particular partner at ENS said to me, the difference between Worksman's and ENS is that, ENS is more like a surgical sort of precision firm, and Worksman's a bit like a bull in a china shop. And I said, oh, on that basis, I think I've made up my mind. And he said, great. I said, yeah, I think I'll be going to Worksman's. And I think that's what elicited his response.
Yeah,
You'll
of
never live
course.
this down. But it was years later that him and I had a cup of coffee, and it was a good chuckle. Like I say, it was a good time at Worksman's, and it was a great crop of lawyers, at that time it was the late 90s. Good crop of lawyers who were all the top of their game,
Most of them probably still around, I guess.
I'm quite old now, Rob. So
You don't look it.
a lot of them are still around. I think that the current leadership crop there, was certainly around when I was there. They were sort of mid-level partners there. But they were all very talented, and they were all going places. It was just they're very, very focused and ambitious. And I liked that about the firm. But at the same time, I liked there was a certain level of informality about the firm, which appealed to me. There was a grittiness about the firm, a grittiness.
It's hard to keep that when you grow as well.
Yeah.
But we'll touch on that when we talk about your current firm that you are.
Just an example. I had my principal at the time was the late Jeff Bortz, Mr. Bortz, as he was known to anyone who hadn't been told. Give me you can call me Jeff speech. Jeff Bortz, he one evening we were working late and the phone rang, and he said to me, "Do you hear that?" So I said, "Yes." He goes, "What's that?" I said, "It's the phone, Mr. Bortz." He said, "No, that's money. This is the sound of money." And it was a really interesting lesson for me, because at that point the realization dropped that we're salespersons. We got to be selling.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
it's interesting. It's nice to hear from a managing partner that admits that, by the way, as well, because there is a big part of that. But that, by the way, is prime 1990s statement from a senior person in an office. 100%. I've got a load of those, of ones that obviously I was younger then, but you hear from directors. So that's a very 90. You hear that.
Yeah,
that's
exactly
money.
Right. And the funny thing is that when you really cut it down, lawyers are salespeople before they're technicians, because you've got to get in front of the client. You've got to convince them, in many cases, that you have a skill that they don't know they need yet.
Yeah.
And if you can't make the sale, then you can't be a rainmaker. Then you're just a technician. Then you're just a cog, right? The good lawyers are the ones that can go and make the rain. And the ones who make the rain are the ones that hear the money when the phone rings.
Yeah, or the email comes in, or whatever. It's interesting you say that, because that's something that we've been working and struggling with for nearly a decade and a half now. And again, without going into too much detail now, but I think you will probably, hopefully, agree that certainly since 2010, there's been a change. The lawyers on almost every level have been told, get out, get clients. What clients are you bringing in? What's going on? And there's many people that we found at the beginning of that process that had got into law to be a technician, because they don't overly like talking to people or presenting or selling. And I think that's something that a lot of lawyers, well, you will have met and employed and interviewed lots of lawyers. And sometimes it's a real struggle that they have to combine that skill now. Do you find that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always say to my kids, it takes all types to make a world. So, those people are important in the same way that the rainmakers are important. But I think, it's a consequence of the shape of, let's call it the big law in South Africa, is that the phone always rings, right? So the phone always rings, and people become complacent. And some people can actually go through a generational cycle of not having to do business development, because the phone is always ringing.
Wouldn't that be
nice? and then all of a sudden the firm closes, and now you find yourself having to be in the marketplace, and so you sit opposite a managing partner or a recruiting partner, and they say, "Well, what clients can you bring in?" You say, "Well, I've worked on this client and that client," and the truth is, you actually don't know how to build a practice. And what many of these law firms have done is that they've left their practitioners basically incapable of being independent fee earners in their own right, and they become reliant on couple of names in the firm. And then I think that's where the problem begins to set in, because none of them have a true sense of financial independence.
It's so important that you said that, because I just brought this up in another recording, actually. And I've said it's something that we talk about a lot in the office back in Cape Town. And one of the things I came up with the other day is that and it's kind of loosely connected to what you were saying there, is that I feel like sometimes, less so at the partner level, but more at the maybe senior associate and associate level, I feel like some people have been trained to stay rather than being good enough to leave. And I think and again, it's not based on any, empirical data or anything. It's a feeling that I have that when people are coming out and going into interview with other firms, and on paper they look incredible, but they just haven't been given all of the training that you might want them to have had. I don't know if you found that.
I don't think it's a coincidence.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a coincidence. And it's a bit like, Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out, right? So,
people are so scared of having to replace people that they train them to not be good enough to leave.
Well, I mean, I think many of them are good enough to leave, but I think they're also led to believe that they won't survive outside from the name. And so there's this sort of, imposter syndrome that sort of sets in, and like, maybe I can't do it out there. And I went through the same thing when I was leaving Worksman's. It was a very difficult time, and I went through a lot of soul searching at the time.
You joined Fluxman's?
I actually, when I left, I joined a good friend and colleague who was a Worksman's partner called Ira Epstein. He's at Fluxman's.
Oh, yeah.
Ira had, together with a prior partner at Worksman's, Robbie Blau, set up a corporate finance business called Nucleus. And when I left Worksman's, I was a bit battered and bruised. I felt as though I needed some time off. And I went to chat to Ira, and I said, what is your advice? What do you recommend? I'm just not sure what I need to do next. And he said, come and tread water with us for a bit, and just like, you lick your wounds up and just see how you feel and where it goes to. And he was remarkable. He took a lot of effort to rebuild me and my confidence, because I think I'd taken quite a hit through that process.
Yeah.
And in his own sort of charming way, Ira sort of, he mentored me back into capability. And so I spent 2 years with him at Nucleus. And then the opportunity came to merge that firm into Fluxman's, which we did at the time.
Yeah, okay.
And then so a couple of us, some of them went on. Harvey Milan and Nicholas McGowan went on to become what is now Milan Scholes. And Ira and myself, we basically folded into Fluxman's. And that was that. And so, I think I spent 3 years at Fluxman's.
This is an interesting time. And please don't, I wasn't aware of what you've just said there. So please, if you feel free to change the subject if you don't want to talk about it. But it's interesting to hear that you had a tough time leaving a firm, or, obviously these days there's a lot made of mental wellness and things like that. But I think one of the things that's very common I've seen across my 22-year career is that there are times in your life where you have, whether it's work pressures, whether it's something that happens outside, whether it's the death in the family or whatever it might be, or whatever something, it sends people into a spiral, and it's hard to come back from that. I mean, I don't want you to share anything you don't want to share, but were you when you left Worksman's, was it a case of overload, burnout? You've been
It was a
fired,
very well documented story, actually. You can go and Google the comments apparently were ascribed to me in Noseweek. And I can confirm for the record that no one ever spoke to me. So any comments that were attributed to me at the time were certainly false and incorrect. But at that time, there was a lot of politics inside the firm. And Carl Steyn was the senior partner there at the time, who's now ironically at Fluxman's.
Okay.
As a consultant, and whom I have great respect for, by the way, but not an easy guy to work with by any stretch. He was very demanding, and
people may say the same thing about us.
Yeah, I fear they say worse things. But it sort of there was a generational transition at Worksman's underway at the time, and I'd moved into Carl's team, maybe a year prior to that. and so I had sort of isolated myself in the firm towards that side of the firm. And a lot of my benefits, from a workflow perspective, came down those channels. So when the real pressure came on, to transition leadership, I sort of felt like I was a ham in the sandwich in some respects, because a lot of the younger partners, some of whom I trained under, were really they were looking to run the show and effectively effect a coup, of the leadership, as these things happen.
Yeah, they do.
And I just felt like I got to a point where I couldn't anymore. And what had happened, ironically, it was my son was born on a Sunday night at about 6:38, somewhere there in the evening. And it was a terrible night.
Your first child?
My first child,
Yeah.
my oldest. And in the morning, I got a phone call really early from one of the partners to say there was a big due diligence that had come into the office. I needed to assemble a team and run it. So I said, look, things are wild at the moment. We just had the baby last night, and I need to get my family home. Can I ask you just to get somebody to just hold the fort until Wednesday? And I'll be there on Wednesday and I'll pick it up. And the answer was, well, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. So, it was that sort of, that conversation for me, set the tone. It was a really difficult thing. And so I took a couple of weeks or months, I can't really recall, to really think whether or not this was something I wanted to invest in.
Yeah.
And I think it was a watershed for me. And so, as much as they had given me a fabulous career and they had really trained me, and there was something about me that it didn't fit, it just didn't sit right with me. Firms go through ebbs and flows where, they amalgamate, they merge, they enlarge, and the culture develops and moves. So who's to say how it'll end up? But at that time, I just felt uncomfortable. I wasn't in a good space. My life was in turmoil, and I just felt I needed a change. But I took the decision to walk out, and if it weren't for Ira, sort of throwing me a lifeline, I may well have stuck it out.
Well, I don't know Ira, but obviously that's he saw something in you. He wouldn't. I guess he's not. He's not going to just back any old horse, as it were. That, as they say. I was going to say donkey, but that was unfair. You know what I mean? Like, he obviously saw something in you, and maybe, again, I don't know him, but maybe he'd been through. Maybe he could see something and just thought,
he's intuitive.
Come and sit here.
He's intuitive. He's got a good sense. He's got a good feel for things and for people and for situations. And I think he also, as much as he'd hate me to say this, but I think he also occasionally he likes receiving a broken sparrow, and nursing them back to life and letting them fly away. And I think in many respects he's good at that. So, in as much as it was a lifeline for me, I think in many respects also, Ira has a good heart. He gives back in very sort of unexpected ways, So and I think there was just a good synergy at the time. There was something
perfect timing,
And also, he's a senior lawyer, and I think he needed somebody to help carry the load for him. So,
well, it all works out perfectly. I think as well. This is something that I just thought of while you're talking. There is that as we go on in our careers, we don't always know how damaging certain things can be. And again, I don't know what was going on in your life at that point, but I think about the things like, when I lost my mother, a few years back, it takes you absolutely ages to get back into, it can be years. And that, and that's
sometimes you never recover. Actually.
Sometimes you never recover. Sometimes you change forever. And I think I certainly did. And it just, for me, I think I spent the first year of that actually trying to get the old Rob back, and until I let go, and then was like, okay, I can settle into a new Rob. And I think that feeds into the pressure, especially when you're at a big firm or in a big team doing big deals, or if you're at a level of a partner. There's so many pressures.
Well, one of the things that's really fundamental, and this for me is key in terms of building culture, is understanding that everybody has a path. Everyone's got a journey. And, we're not all on the same journey. And so, these pressures that you talk about, they don't happen in a vacuum. They happen inside someone's life, right?
Yeah.
And so, people go through these growth stages where they need to find expression. And so the environment's got to it's got a little bit of flex, be able to allow individuals to find expression. And it may be something very simple, like just growing your hair a bit longer, and I say that.
Now you're just rubbing it in.
Yeah. And I say that because I think the individuality of the person is what, if allowed to be given expression, is what allows them to produce their best value. And so these people that go through these difficult times in these big law firms find it's hard to fit into the tram lines. They've got bits and pieces of them that flow over, and they're trying really hard to keep them inside the tram lines because this is the way that it goes. And that, for me, that was the biggest challenge for me, is that I felt this need to express myself personally in ways which the institution just didn't give me the flexibility to do.
I found that, but not with a company, but with a city. When I lived in Hong Kong.
Oh, wow.
For 9 years. In hindsight, it's a wonderful thing, and on the surface, it made me, and we became #1, award-winning. It looked great on the surface, but what I feel like, and to use your analogy of the tram lines, is that it was a city that didn't suit me. Yeah. It was too much. It was overbearing, and I was always trying to stay within the lines. And it wasn't until I left and was like, "That's not, that's not for me."
And the thing is that we're emotional beings first, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard for us to transition those emotions into like conscious thoughts. And so you got to encourage people to express the way that they feel. And sometimes it comes to a solution. It comes to a point where they go, "Okay, maybe this isn't the place for me." And that's a great outcome, right?
Yeah.
Might not be great for the business in the short term, but it's good for the business in the long run, because what you don't want is, you don't want someone who's not properly invested in the business. They really got to fit in.
I couldn't agree more. And it's one of the things I was talking about with someone recently. And one of the reasons why when we hire at GRM, we will always start as a contractor.
Yeah.
It's because, and I look them in the eye and say, because you might hate this.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to work really hard. We're going to enjoy it, but it might not be right for you. And that doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean we failed. It's just not right.
Some people like vanilla ice cream, some like chocolate.
Exactly.
Nothing wrong with that.
And I think that's something that we've touched on it a lot, especially when you're talking about lawyers who are, especially in the bigger firms, where it's, there's a lot of bravado, there's a lot of ego, it's all about the big deals, it's all, you're expected to reach, and there's people in these firms who shouldn't be there, for their own happiness.
They're not well suited.
And they don't want to leave because it would be seen as failure. And then, South Africa, the legal market is so, it's splintered, to say the least. What we find is when they finally decide to leave, they don't know where to go, because where's going to suit them better.
And the funny thing is, it's a great segue into the conversation about how we view the marketplace. Is that we're a motley crew of people that came from big law firms, and we all had a similar experience. And I think in many respects we're all unique individuals that sort of spilled over those tram lines in one way or another. And so, we sort of recognize that in each other, and we give each other the space. But we also recognize that there are people sort of trapped in a space in some of these big law firms, and they don't think they have an option. They don't think that they can do what they do there somewhere else, because they think that what they do there is a function of being there.
Yeah.
And it's sense. A confidence issue. It's a confidence issue, and they risk averse. And
they might be told constantly.
Yeah, certainly the messaging will be there. Yeah. If you leave, you won't be able to make it.
Yeah.
And certainly that was said to me a couple of times. You're not going to make it out here if you leave. I said, well, I'll take my chances. And you may end up having to eat rats and mice for a while in order to survive. But sooner or later you'll migrate up, to chickens and things, and eventually you'll get to bigger game. And as long as you're consistent and you show up every day and you're diligent and you just keep chipping away. And one of those things is you just got to believe that you're capable of doing it. There's definitely enough deal flow in the market, and there's enough work in the marketplace, certainly in the mid-market space, to be able to keep sole practitioners alive. I actually think I read a stat yesterday. There's 6,800 sole practitioners in South Africa.
Yeah, well, we were just, I was talking about this morning. One of my colleagues phoned the Law Society a couple of weeks ago and asked them to send the numbers through, because they think that there's been almost a doubling of that since COVID.
Yeah, I think it was a 2022 number, I think I read.
It'd be interesting to, those numbers haven't come to us yet, but
and
it'd
I
be
think
interesting to see.
There's only 10 law firms that have more than 50 professionals.
Yes, that's true. Yeah,
I think it's 10 law firms, 50 professionals.
Yeah, it's the ultimate pyramid, isn't it? As it were.
And so you basically, when you leave one of those firms, you think to yourself, either I've got to go to another big firm, and so you plug into the same machine but with a different culture, and so you've got to relearn the culture, and you end up walking around on eggshells for 2 years. And also, you go in developing new relationships for workflow, and it's tough, man. It's tough. And if you're going to do that, you might as well do it for yourself, or do it in an environment where you're going to at least have a shot at making it without having to deal with all the other stuff.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons why firms like your current firm that you are managing partner of, and some of the ones in terms of numbers that are maybe at the 20 person to 40 person, maybe 15 to 35 people. These are so important, these companies, because they actually give, they could be very, very good homes for people coming out of the big shops who then just go, I don't know what options I've got. I can't go in-house. I may as well just set up on my own. It's like there are other options.
There are indeed, and certainly, from our perspective, those are the candidates we're looking for. We're looking for those people that want this level of independence. I always make this joke is that all lawyers only want two things. The one is they want to earn more money, and the other is they don't want to be told what to do.
Oh.
And as long as your model gives
I've spent 22 years in recruitment with people like that.
As long as the model gives you that, then I think, for the most part, if these candidates at these big law firms who are disgruntled or feeling unhappy and out of place, if they know that they've got a good prospect of being able to write some fees for themselves, they could pretty much, certainly in an environment like ours, they could pretty much look after themselves and be independent. And that would give them a great deal of emotional space to be able to spread themselves over the tram lines a bit, but also give them the financial reward for the work that they do. Because, as you know better than anyone else, in these big law firms, the remuneration models are a source of so much contention. And there are people that are sitting around going, why am I doing all the work, but that guy is chilling in Plet? And he's not writing proportionately nearly as much as he's taking home. Now his debtors book is much worse than mine. I've got a clean debtors book, and my cost to company relative to what I'm writing is so much lower. I should be earning more, and yet you have to wait for that to be called up for that next level, right? And you also get access. It's a bit like a secret society. You get access to another level of work, once you get pushed up. And so you're trying to buy your time and work your way through that system. And I don't think it's necessary, actually, because at the end of the day, like I say, you're your own person, and you got to be happy doing what you do, especially in law, which is brutal. And there's no, there's absolutely, it's relentless. There's no let up. And you can't do that and be unhappy at the same time. It's just not possible.
Yeah, you might not be able to change the job, but you can certainly change the environment.
Yeah.
This brings me on very nicely to your more recent history. So I don't know what you can share and what you can't, but obviously Andersen's, I'm old enough to remember the initial Arthur Andersen, although I was quite young when that all went by the wayside. but obviously they come back into the global market and I don't know how much you can share about the strategies and things like that. But one of the things that struck me when we first spoke, which was probably about a year ago or so, was you were, as a leader of the firm, very open and honest, very refreshing. You shared the positioning of the firm, which I thought was absolutely, the way I've described it to people, actually, it's like, it's that sweet spot in between, with the focus being on tax and law. It's, you know, almost, and again, there'll be people listening to this who disagree with me, but in my head, it's a sweet spot where you've got the big four audit firms who've never quite been able to get the law right. And then you've got a lot of the law firms who've never quite been able to get the tax bit right. Some of them do all right, but you've got that. And from a private wealth perspective, it all just fits very nicely. But there's the current iteration, did that come out of tabacs and things like that?
How
did that work?
We did. So let me just take you back to 2002. So in 2002, Arthur Andersen had the Enron audit failure.
Yes.
So as you might recall, Arthur Andersen was a Big Five auditing firm, as they were then known, the Big Five.
Yeah.
And it was a major international scene. You know, it was a really big deal. And it really was was it
2002?
Just 2002. And it kicked off a great deal of legislative intervention and regulatory intervention around the auditing practice. But at the time, Arthur Andersen, or Andersen, as I'll call it, was split into three. There was audit, there was advisory, which was basically tax, let's say, tax and legal. And then there was consulting, and consulting split off to become Accenture, what is today Accenture.
Oh, yes, of course.
$200 billion business.
Yeah.
And then the audit partners around the world sort of went off to join audit firms in different jurisdictions. In South Africa, many of them went to KPMG. In the East, they went to Deloitte. EY was a recipient of a lot in Europe. And I think the US got a lot of PwC, a lot went to PwC. So the audit guys went off, the Accenture guys went off, and then there was sort of some tax and legal. And in many respects, what a lot of people don't know is that Andersen was actually one of the biggest law firms in the world in 2002. But they weren't called Andersen. They were Garrigues in Spain. They were Archibald in France. They were Luther in Germany, Rajantan in Singapore.
Oh, Rajantan, yeah.
Yeah, they were all Andersen companies.
Oh, interesting.
And so they were a big law firm, but a lot of people knew that they were affiliated with Andersen, but they were part of the same. They were in a firm partnership, an affiliation. When Andersen imploded in 2002, a group of the partners in the US sort of coalesced around about 700 clients, and they decided to sort of restart. And it was only not easy at all. Not in that market.
I mean, that was such a famous case.
Yeah,
that was all that anyone was talking about.
Really difficult. And the decision which came, probably 8 years later to pick up the Andersen brand and rebrand as Andersen, was necessary because there was a need to go global again. And the reason for that is because Andersen, as the story goes, was working for Facebook at the time. A lot of high net worth tech clients were in the Andersen sort of tax net in Silicon Valley at the time, which of course was a big boom time, in 2000. And so they sort of seeded the work in that growth phase, and they lost Facebook to EY at some point, and they realized because they couldn't service EY outside of the US, so they realized they needed a global strategy, and so that was the plan. So what they did is they built out the strategy around legal and tax, and the reason being is because they're so intricately interwoven that it's really farcical to break them up. It's farcical. Tax is law and law is tax. And it just so happens that tax involves counting stuff. And so in some jurisdictions, accountants have become the predominant go-to for tax. Like in South Africa, Big Four dominate tax. And then in some jurisdictions like the US, tax is really dominated by lawyers. And so, in all these jurisdictions, the plan was to try and find as much geographic reach as possible in a shorter space time, and get tax and legal built out. And so in South Africa, the call came to Tabax, and I was at Tabax at the time. And that call was, would you guys would you consider doing a deal with us? And so we had that conversation with them, and there was a unanimous decision that was taken at the time to do this. And so we signed on and we went for it. A big part of the hypothesis and the business model is tax, right? So the idea is that the big four accounting firms have got sort of really deep technical tax capabilities. It's not only deep, but broad as well. So they would go to customs and excise and transfer pricing and indirect tax and all sorts of things, all specialized areas. And in law firms, generally, they kept it focused on a very narrow strip of tax. So what would happen invariably is that all the tax would sit with the accounting firms, and most of that tax work was coming out of the audit clients. So they had these big audit books, and the audit clients are referred to as Channel 1 clients. And as long as you weren't a Channel 1 client, you could do work for them in an advisory space. Well, that's how it's become now with the regulatory changes post Enron. Because you can't have auditors marking their own homework, right? So
that's probably happened too many times.
Exactly. So over time, there's been a split where many of these big firms, these big four firms, if a client transitions from a Channel 2 client, which is an advisory client, to an audit client, Channel 1 client, then the advisory team has to start working on them. And that for me was a clear flag. It was a clear flag to say there's a problem in the market here, because the big law firms don't have the breadth of capability that's needed to service their clients. So what they're going to do is they're going to hop to another big four, or they're going to go to a tier 2 accounting firm. But they all got the same problems, right? Because audit rotation demands that these big corporates should be moving their stuff around regularly. And so, once the audit is moved here, then all of a sudden they're going to move again. And so these relationships are never long-term relationships in a way that I would like to see them, certainly in my business. So having regard to the fact that, the big law firms hadn't set themselves up specifically to deal with that, most of these law firms do a lot of opinion work, they do some structuring, and maybe some advisory, and they set up to be ancillary or supporting to the corporate teams in many respects. And so, that for me was a mistake. And in hindsight, I didn't really understand that until I had the conversation with Andersen. Then I realized that actually the model that we needed to pursue was we had to be more aggressive in tax. We had to be more aggressive in tax. And so at Tabax, we had to start building our tax. Because the day we signed with Andersen, we had no tax people.
No.
And we gave them a commitment we'd grow tax, right? And that model...
I suspect that was part of the deal. Like, you have to do it. Right?
Yeah, and we had to give a commitment that we would grow it out and we would expand. And we had to show a level of ambition about what we wanted to do. And doing that means having to build priorities, right? And having to allocate budget and strategy. And so, that was the plan. The plan was to go and build our tax. And we recruited some really great tax people, and we started developing, traction. And then, it sort of, when it became clear that there was this sort of morphing professional services capability, because what would happen is we'd start bringing in tax clients from the US, and they would need some kind of compliance work done. They need to be registered for tax, need to have VAT filings done. So the question is, do we send it out the firm or do we do it internally? The problem is when you send it out the firm, the people to whom you send it are the ones having the bi-monthly conversations with the client, not you. They're the ones that are lifting the hood, looking underneath and seeing the problems. And then they are the ones that are troubleshooting the problems. And so what we've basically done is we've taken that pipe and we just put it into someone else's tank.
Yeah, it's not going to be long before the client goes, yeah.
So I said, look, guys, we've got to create an ecosystem where they can't just jump out from the boat, right? Because once they land on the beachhead, we've got to be able to have a campsite where we can hold them, feed them, and just nurture them for a while so we can build the relationship so that move across is temporary. Whatever we refer them out to, it's temporary. So it can't be the first salvo. you know.
Yeah, otherwise it's the same like any client relationship. If you're not doing the work at some point, you know, they'll cut you out.
Yeah, exactly. The relationship.
You don't own it anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we had to take a decision. For example, you know, do we go long on compliance? And you know, if you ask any lawyer and say, should we do compliance? The first thing they're going to do is they're going to go, oh hell, that's not what we do. You know. But then it requires a particular mindset to go, you know, are we a law firm, or are we something a little bit different? Because the business is now forcing you to rethink at an existential level what your business, you know, what are you doing here? And when people ask me what I do, usually my first response is, I advise clients on producing value and mitigating risk.
And then they go, you're a lawyer.
And then, yeah, sometimes. But then when they hear that I'm a lawyer, they go, why didn't you just say that? So that's what I do. You know, I produce value and I mitigate risk. It just so happens I do it in the shape of a lawyer. And so when you adopt that methodology or that framework, that philosophy, then nothing is off limits anymore. You know, now you're an advisor. It just so happens that you've got a toolbox. You give yourself the option to hold more tools. Compliance isn't sexy. The margins are they're thin. But the truth is, you build relationships with clients. You build trust. You build long-term, sustainable contact points.
Yeah,
and that's
building the client relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it's an easy sell down into your litigation or labor or, you know, environmental or regulatory.
Which is a lot harder in the big shops when you've got to be chasing targets and you've got to be chasing revenue to really give the clients everything they need. Yep. If the margins are too small, or
those cross-selling opportunities in the big firms are tougher to execute than I think people are prepared to accept. I mean, you know, in those firms, if you didn't have dedicated BD people that were connecting the dots, you would just have silos running in streams down the firm.
Yeah,
and you would never have access to. I would never have access to your clients because you're a labor lawyer and I'm a corporate lawyer, and you're not going to introduce them to me. Or we just can't find the common link, you know.
Yeah, or you're in a massive office and don't even talk to you anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. But when you own the tax relationship, you're actually invariably you're sitting at C-suite level.
Yeah.
And that C-suite level allows you to tap that relationship. And once there's a trusted relationship in place, it's a very easy sell. And in this market where it's so hard to go and win clients off other firms, some of them are entrenched brand to brand, you know, some of them are entrenched to relationships. It's so hard to dislodge those relationships.
Yeah.
And so you've got to keep what you get. You can't afford it. So if you and I are in the same firm and you got a client and I got a client, we both have to have two clients. We have to have clients.
Yeah, well, not only that, but you know, these clients, the bigger law firms are becoming so good at institutionalizing those clients. I mean, I was chatting to someone from one of the firms that will remain nameless, and that person said, I don't know how anybody takes anybody these days. We've spent the last 15 years making sure that the clients are the firm's clients, and so that's also difficult when people want to leave. But that
presupposes, by the way, that those clients don't have an elastic economic profile.
Half the time they'll leave.
Yeah, I mean, if they feel they're being handled financially, they'll leave.
Yeah. I'm going somewhere smaller. I can charge you less money.
It's more elastic as long as they have a level of trust.
Yeah,
and it's comparable in quality, they'll move.
So you're a partner at Tabax. For those who are listening outside of South Africa, it was what we would probably describe as a mid-sized firm.
A boutique it was defined by them as.
Okay, that always usually just means small, doesn't it? From a marketing perspective, but But again, I don't know what transcribed, but you've then become, you've left and taken that Andersen's relationship on.
Yeah, I think there was at the time, you know, I was co-regional managing partner for Africa of Andersen's. So I held that position while I was.
So within Tabax, and you've got that separate relationship. So you're dealing with Andersen's.
I was dealing with Andersen's. I was the interface and the relationship holder, and you know, to be perfectly honest, it was problematic for some of the partners because, you know, as gatekeeper, so as to speak, to that relationship, it was difficult for them to be able to control their own destiny in relation to that relationship. So some of the older partners, I think, felt that there was a vulnerability for them there. But to be honest, I thought it was the future of the firm, and I didn't go out to build myself as the gatekeeper for that relationship. I just don't think anyone was interested, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I've never met all my life, lawyers are the most. They have the most apathy of anyone I've ever met. Lawyers generally don't.
I wrote an article about this.
I did, yeah.
Apathy is our biggest danger.
Yeah, exactly. So it's spot on. And so, everyone's like, I'm busy digging holes. I can't worry about the big picture. I'm digging holes. And so digging holes means writing fees, right? So, and we all have to do that. We got to do what we got to do. But at the end of the day, no one wanted to own that relationship. And I stepped in because I really felt that the firm had a strong future there. But as it turns out, there were different ideas in the firm about what was necessary going forward. And I'd invested a lot into this relationship, and I was fully committed. And I think I'd also convinced myself of the hypothesis, the tax legal hypothesis, and it was starting to show financially. The model was beginning to generate the fees. And it was just a question of time. It was about being patient and making the right calls. And so the decision was taken by slightest of margins, that the Andersen relationship should end, and they would revert back to Bax. And it was
that the other partners took that decision.
Yeah, I mean, it was I think I've simplified it down quite a lot, but there was a lot of internal stuff going on, and it was necessary for this project to be salvaged. So there was too much at stake. So
that must be frustrating for you as well. Like, you're a partner in a team. I'm going to guess had about 15 or so other partners.
Yeah, 20. I don't
yeah.
know.
And you're sitting there and you're going, I know this is the future. This is what we should be doing. And if people for other your colleagues for whatever reason, digging holes or just generally not interested, or maybe stepped away from that Andersen's relationship, like, you're sitting there going, come on guys, come on, like, this is what we need to be doing.
One of the fallacies that existed at the time was that, well, if we have the brand, the phone must ring, right? The phone has to ring.
I mean, yeah,
and so
that would be amazing, wouldn't it?
How many referrals have we got? And the answer isn't so much how many referrals have we got and how much fees have we written. It's about what have we built in terms of longer term sustainability. What have we built in terms of our optionality going forward? How have we built a robust business model? And actually, ironically, when you do the numbers did work out. With one partner that we'd recruited, he not only paid for himself, but he covered all the license fees. That was just in 1 year, himself. So in my view, it was a no-brainer. But I think when you're assessing it, you've got to take a view in principle about whether this is something to be done. One of these, we call Tabax a boutique firm, but it was one of the few boutique firms left.
Yeah.
All the boutique firms that broke away in the 90s, early 2000s, from the big firms, and this was a breakaway from Denise Rates. Really, that was its origins, its roots. These breakaways all subsequently died. And the reason why most of them, almost exclusively all of them, died was because I don't think that many of the founding partners had the ability or the foresight to be able to know when the time had come, when they outstayed the party, right?
Yeah.
And to step aside and let a second generation, a 2.0, run the game, move into the next level. And part of that means changing identity, changing culture, shifting spaces, shifting perceptions. And it's a difficult thing for them to sometimes, adopt, embrace, and accept. And Mervyn Tabak, to his credit, who I'm very fond of, he's now immigrated to Australia with his grandkids. But Mervyn Mervyn really had a desire to see a 2.0, a version of the firm moving forward, a sustainability. And I think he was deeply disappointed at the breakup, because I think he felt that it had a lot of legs. But be that as it may, at that time he didn't really have much of a say left. I think he was merely he was ceremonial in a sense, and so very disappointing for him. I think that project had come to an end, but it was an opportunity for me and some of the partners that came with me.
And when was this? What year are we talking?
This was exactly 2 years ago.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, it was September 2 years ago that the first split happened, the first sort of cracks in the armor came through, and so by 1 January, so in 1 January 2023, 1 January 23, we opened doors.
Yeah,
that was it.
So that's why I say you're in an unusual situation, because you're with a global brand, but it's still very much in a startup mode.
It is,
which is actually the fun bit. Let's be honest.
It is, and it comes with its own stresses and its own challenges. Because in as much as Andersen has offered, to fund us, and they've kindly given us, some assistance, there's a reticence certainly to take more than what we think is absolutely necessary, because we've seen this with other big global firms where they take on these big lines and they can't service them. And so we had to find a way to say, as a matter of personal credibility and pride, to say, we'll build the firm out. We do need some working capital. We'll build the firm out. But what we're not going to do is come and ask you for a big check and then spend it on, like Chelsea Football Club, spend it on all big players that honestly can't put a jersey on game day and score the goals. So we took a decision early on to try and keep it lean and to revisit the model of a law firm and try and reshape it in a way that reflects our own experiences of these law firms.
It might be unfair of me to say, because and to try to link, but we have seen it with foreign firms in South Africa, and I saw it a lot in Asia as well, when they moved in and spent a lot of money and then didn't get it and moved out. And I think the difference, what you're looking at is others, lesser leaders than yourself, might have just kept tapping them up for money until the tap runs dry. Making crazy promises, and what you've done is you clearly understand the market, and you're saying, look, this is what we'll do. Keep those lines of communication going. Yeah, you can, maybe you definitely haven't said this, but maybe it's like, keep your money, just pay me as a bonus when we hit the time.
Certainly never said that.
No, you certainly haven't. But, in my head, I'm like, yeah, you just keep it until I, but it's, and I think, again, you come from a unique position where you've been through the market, running your own shop as well as you've had your trials and tribulations. You've been at the big firms. You're with IRA as well, which became Fluxman. So you've seen a few things. And that's not to say that we've obviously recently had Hogan Lovells and A&O announce that they're leaving, and it's not to say that the partners they brought in were not good enough or didn't have enough strategy experience like yourself. I wouldn't say that. I don't know them well enough to know that. But I just think there's a strategy sometimes, and I've seen it in Asia when I was there for a decade, where foreign firms come in and they believe they can just plug and play, and that's it. Whereas one of the things I said about the A&O thing when a journalist called me is just like that, you've got to understand the nuances of the market here. South Africa is a market with 11 official languages, 3 capital cities. It's a new country, certainly from a democratic perspective, 30 years old or so, making some big mistakes at government level sometimes.
Your policy framework is key to growth and development, right?
And I just think, that when I first started talking to you, last year, it was just really interesting to understand your strategy and how that fits in with Andersen's, which seems to be working quite well. Certainly from outsider's perspective.
The first thing is we decided that we're less interested in sharing profits than we are in sharing revenue. I think we think that revenue sharing model.
There's the thumbnail. That'll get some viewers.
Yeah. I think profit sharing is problematic because these businesses are a lot like football clubs. Is that you have to conduit the cash that you get from your clients into your superstars, into your team, right? You got to pay the team, and I think the lion's share of what you recover, goes to the team. But you've got to pay people based on their performances, because what happens is you get disgruntled people who keep churning out big and strong performances, and they turn around and go, why is it that I'm still at the back of the queue financially? And there are some big earners that just simply can't cut the mustard, and they shouldn't be,
or don't help anybody else.
Or don't.
That's
help
another
else,
thing. Yeah.
Or there's no culture of cross selling or referrals.
We've definitely all had, well, in your case, lawyers, or worked with lawyers, and in my case, recruitment consultants who are brilliant earners, but they probably can't remember the name of the person who sits next to them. They just literally focus on themselves.
Yeah.
And it's that whole thing. How do we grow a culture with someone who just is only in it for themselves?
Yeah. So, I mean, at the start of it, I mean, I think we kicked off this Andersen chapter 2 years ago with a very clear decision in our mind that we wanted to make sure that culture was at the center. And if culture to be at the center, if it had to be at the center the way we wanted it to be, we had to get a handle on remuneration. Like we had to get that right. And the remuneration had to reward people for not only doing work, but also for referring work, participating in work.
And this is what you mean by the revenue side, right?
Yeah, so it's it's around collections, because what happens in the big firms is the debtors book grows, and then everyone sits around a partners meeting table and they go, guys, we have to collect more debtors.
Yeah, there's no point in
why
billing
they're saying
100
that?
million if you have only collected 2.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and the reason why they say that is because they know that their Prada is at stake, right? They're going to keep making the payments on the Prada. So you Rob, you got to go and collect your book so that I can pay my Prada, And
That's
is where
crazy,
the
isn't it?
culture begins to sort of break down. And so,
or sorry to interject, but there's also, and I won't mention names of firms, but where maybe a well-functioning team that produces less revenue, like in the case I'm thinking of, a small firm, but they had a family law team, and then they just cut that whole team out. But that was a decent earner, but it wasn't enough to pay for the Prado.
Yeah,
when their markets went down.
Exactly.
And it's like, well,
cross-subsidization, exactly.
So without going into too much detail, because we don't want to give your competitors too much, but the sharing of revenue then would be, rather than profit, would be more acknowledging the value they're bringing
in terms of not only the fees you write, but the fees you collect.
It's interesting. And I think, again, we might touch on it in a second, but when you branch into newer areas as well, that may not, unconventional. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. It brings them into the fold almost.
It does.
Yeah,
it does, and it also means that everybody is a contributor in their own right, and so it's hard to judge somebody who brings in less fees. Because they're not taking as much as you. They're taking what they are doing and the value that they're producing. There is an element here of how much value do you produce for non-billable work. That's definitely a consideration, and so we do factor that in. And there are allowances for top-ups around people contributing in sort of non-billable spaces.
Well, that's the hardest thing that leaders like you and I face, right? Is the actual true value of certain people. Like, especially in a place like, for instance, my recruitment team or your lawyers, where a lot of it will be dependent on the money they're bringing in and they're collecting. But actually, some of them are adding huge value in terms of management or leadership or whatever it might be.
BD or
and how do you value that?
Well, it's not a science, right? So I mean, in as much as we want metrics, we want to be able to be driven by metrics, and we can be able to look at a spreadsheet and go, it's an art form. I think there's some, there can be a rule of thumb. But I think you've got to have a handle on what the quality of a contribution is, and I think there needs to be a comparative remuneration for that value. So invariably, we would set aside a pot of revenue, every year for bonuses, which are, let's call them bonuses, which are unfee related. And in some cases, it just could be training. It could be working on the precedent base. It could be, and so what we do is we have codes for timekeeping around various aspects of our non-billable stuff. So every week I get a dashboard, a flash report that shows that this is what Jack is doing, this is what Jill's doing, and I can see how much time they're spending on training, business development, and I get a fairly good bar graph. I get a pretty good idea of who's doing what. And against that backdrop, then I'll have a look and see, for example, in the business development space, who's producing content. So if you're spending a lot of time on PD, you're not producing content, then there's a disconnect. Something's not right. If you're spending a lot of time on training, but it's not coming through in the day-to-day operations, then there's a disconnect. And so there's a level of observation that's needed, to be able to assess, and then we'll make a decision about how we empty that bucket out at the end of the year.
That's a really good, and again, I know that I don't want to feel like I'm just praising you for the listeners' sake, but I've worked with you for a bit, and I have said it, and I'll say it to anyone that blew in the face. I think from what I know, and that's actually new information to me, but what I know about your style of working and your remuneration, that you're constantly working on it, you're constantly looking at it. Each person who gets interviewed, even by you, is treated as an individual. You're looking at what could work for them,
100%.
And that is exactly why I believe firms like yours will be at the top of the tree in the next 5 years, because it's that kind of leadership. It's not going to work just doing things the same old way.
Yeah, I don't think tomorrow looks like yesterday.
Yeah.
I don't know what tomorrow looks like, but I know it doesn't look like yesterday.
It's got AI in it. That's all we know.
It's definitely got AI in it. And from our perspective, a lot of grey hair. But I will say that, I think regardless of whether it's commercially sound, I feel that it's important that individuals are seen as people first. Like, it's really important. Some people have different capabilities to others. Some people can do stuff that others can't do. And I think that in order for there to be an even playing field where everyone respects each other for what they bring, your remuneration policy's got to wrap that. It's got to be the wrapping that closes that up, because without it, there's going to be some level of resentment or disconnect between who the person is and the value they bring and what they're earning.
Yeah, so, especially if you're a firm that turns around and goes, give us everything and we'll reward you, and then doesn't.
Exactly right. And so we really want to try and be the best that we can be. And to be perfectly frank, we don't have it right. It's like you say, it's a constant, it's an organic process. It needs reflection, it needs input, it needs conversation, and it will grow and change in time. And if I look at where we are today relative to where we were a year ago, we had such incredible teething problems around the model. I mean, just running the spreadsheets, keeping the spreadsheets clean, was really tough for us, because it's a complex calculation, and it requires a significant level of like legwork. We're lucky now. We've built a tool, a tech tool, which shows online. It's got dashboards with pie graphs and earnings and things. So very, very nice. So each fee earner can access their bit on the dashboard and see where they are relative to their earnings in any given month.
Very nice.
And which of the clients are that need to pay in order for the payout to kick. Those kinds of things. And let me be clear, we underpin the staff. So it's not just purely remuneration based on performance. So we say, well, we recognize that you've got bills. We recognize that you've got to ramp up. There's a process here. And so we'll underpin you. But if we underpin you must know that there needs to be some level of return. So we've got to put a number on it and say, like, if we underpin you here, you got to get to a particular number. And that gives people some comfort. And in many cases, it actually doesn't give people enough comfort. And when it doesn't give them enough comfort, that's when my eyebrow goes up and I go, well, is this person who they say they are? Because
Yeah.
You've seen this. I've seen this.
Yeah,
We sit
yeah.
in interviews all the time, and people say, "Yeah, no, I can bring these clients. Yeah, well, I can do that. Yeah, I can write these fees." And then the time comes to write it, and they haven't written the fees, or they can't collect it, or it's a problem. And then, who's sitting with the risk?
You.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the business has to go on, right? And it can't go on at the expense of one or two people. It's got to be right. So the model's got to be able to adjust, to be able to keep that momentum moving. But more than that, it changes the financial model to make our base cost, like our base fixed cost, predictable.
Yeah.
And to the extent
Vital.
that yeah, exactly right. And so we can budget quite much easier than most law firms, because we know that we get our salary bill, let's call it for a salary bill, for the most part, fluctuates with the collections. And so while our fixed cost is stable, we know when we're in and out the money on the fluctuations. And it's not as though we have a salary bill that's linear. We have a salary bill that's flexible based on what's actually happening. And that, for me, makes us a lot more resilient, and it gives us many more options, provided the lawyers are prepared to take that view, on their own practices and their ability to earn money.
Yeah, and it's the resilience that I like about that model and about the firm, because that's something that I think a lot of lawyers that we certainly work with in the recruitment space aren't yet 100% sure of it. So you've got to understand, well, first and foremost, I don't think there's a lawyer alive, certainly one in South Africa, that won't agree with the statement that we are going through a very, very big changing time in the legal market. The way that law services are offered, the way that people are remunerated are probably the main changes we'll see over the next 5 years. Your model of part fixed, part merit-based is exactly the way that most law firms would love to be. I often say to people, in more, certainly if they're in one of the big five, is if you were to design a law firm today, how would it look? Would it look like? It would look exactly different. Yeah. Completely different. Sorry. So I think where you're at, personally, from what I know in the marketplace, is exactly what that's giving you the opportunity to grow. But we are at a changing point where and obviously we've just touched on firms leaving Johannesburg. So there's been a lot of movement this year, and we've spoken to a lot of partners. There's still a bit in their head where they're stuck in the old and they need to move to the new.
Yeah, it's so tough, Rob. And we've had this conversation outside of this room before, and it's hard to convince people that what they're doing is not sustainable. So we see lawyers sort of jump from firm to firm every 2 or 3 years, because eventually, the cycle catches up with them, and they know that they can't keep writing the fees.
And they keep getting asked, where are they?
Where are the fees? And so, and the pressure is not only it robs them of self-respect, but they're painting themselves into a corner, because it's such a small market. Everyone, we know who they are, right? For the most part. And so it gets increasingly difficult for them. But also, at a personal level, imagine having to get up every day and know that you're doing your best to get across the line, and that you're getting a check at the end of the month, and you're not going to be able to write against that expectation. And
people are made differently to you and I, my friend. Well, I couldn't sleep if I was promising something to someone and they were going to give me tens of millions based on that. I personally couldn't sleep. I would be like,
but it's not as though they're not trying, right? I think that's
probably where you justify it to yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
I am trying.
Area, exactly.
They know they're not going to do it, but
and if they don't do it, that's okay. I'll just I'll find there'll be something else. I'll move on. I'll do something else. And in our model, we give them the opportunity to say, take that pressure off yourself. So as long as you know that your base level is what you need, and it's fine. If you don't hit those numbers, then it's no big deal, right? You're still going to be okay.
You'll get there.
You'll get there. I mean, you won't earn as much as you would have at somewhere else, but that pressure doesn't exist for you.
Yeah.
And if you want to go on a holiday, for a month, go on holiday for a month.
And that's where it's quite impossible to put a number value on that lack of pressure. But I think many people come into that kind of model and certainly talk to me about it, and they see it as more pressure because they're like, well, I've got to go out and I've got to win the clients. And I'm like, it's less pressure. You've got time because you're not, and it's all very true and it's very transparent. And there are firms like yours and others that will remain nameless, but they are doing it right.
Yeah.
And lawyers are doing very well.
Yeah. I mean, I know some people in our firm that are earning significantly more than I am. And they are, good couple of years junior to me. And it's for no other reason other than because they work hard and they're diligent.
You wait until you make them managing partner, and then they'll have so much admin to do. You can go back and go, I'll just make the fees.
I always say to my team, I look forward to the day when I'm redundant and you throw me out the door, because then I know that I would have made a success of the business. I honestly, and I realize that this business very quickly will become something that probably will result in me being elevated to a level of incompetence.
The Peter principle, isn't it? Isn't that what it's called?
I think so.
There's Lawrence Peter. I think I've ordered the book. It should be coming soon. Yeah, Lawrence Peter.
To get to a point where you know that someone else is better equipped for the job, and you say to yourself, okay, the point has now come.
Well, you look like the kind of guy that will admit that. Yeah. I would as well.
Apparently not. I've been told in the beginning, we started the conversation where I said I've been called a lot of things, but included in that is that I'm opinionated, that I'm narcissistic or arrogant, and I'm a lot of other things. But I think, for the most part, my fundamental objective here is to build a legacy firm. I'm really not in it for the control. I'm not in it for the for the role. I really want to be in a position where in years to come, my grandkids will drive past the building, look at a sign on the building and it says Andersen, and say, my grandfather was part of building that business. And if I've done that, it would have been a good time. And in order to do that, we would have made some money. So
Well, look, we can. I don't think I'm speaking out of school here by saying that we know that every legal market I've ever worked in, there's a lot. That everyone has an opinion about someone. Which I'm sure you've been around long enough to at least have nurtured a few opinions. But I can safely say to everyone listening that in the dealings that I've had with you, you've been nothing but pleasant and strategic. Rob. And, it's always nice to work with someone who values what we do, knows the challenges that we go through to try and get the people to you. It's a mutual respect there. So maybe I think we were all a bit narcissistic when we were younger, when we were in our early 20s, but maybe not.
It's not so much about the message, it's about the person who delivers it, right? So it's always contextual. So, when that kind of a message comes in, the really important thing is not to take it personally, but rather to try and understand the context. Some of those people are, it's a challenge sometimes, but some of those people, are in positions where they honestly feel, if you hold someone to account, if you call someone out and you hold them to account, it's going to be uncomfortable for them.
And they don't like it.
And they're going to say, you're arrogant or you're opinionated, because it's an easy out, right? And I'm not suggesting that I'm neither of those things, because we all have moments where we're not at our best. But I think that for the most part, I think I've got to a point where I realize that the business needs a particular decision-making capability. And sometimes decisions in these positions are hard. They're not easy decisions. And then, you can't be friends with everybody all the time, right? And so you got to draw a line around things.
Well, look, I was chatting about this earlier, but not specifically about you, but it's authenticity, and you seem to have it. In the dealings that we've had together, you seem to be very much yourself. And I think when it's the managing partner doing that, and delivering with messages, even if they're not pleasant messages, then they can see in your eyes that you mean it, that if you say, look, I'm really sorry that this is happening, or if it's good news, they can see that there's an authenticity. But I think, I was recording something earlier, and obviously when you turned up, we bumped into each other. There was other partners here. One of the things that I've chatted about with Nikita before is that it is in many cases, the new leadership, people like yourself and me and Nikita and others, there's an honesty that comes through all of us in the way that we work that is also, and it's also a double-edged sword because
it hurts.
It hurts when people say things because our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. Is that we put our heart and soul into everything we do.
Vulnerable in
I reckon
moments.
if I called you at midnight, not that I ever would, I reckon you'd answer.
Oh, definitely.
And I'm the same. And Nikita phones me very early sometimes, and I'm like, I know she needs something, and it's because we're working and we're hustling and we're doing it. And then when someone criticizes, like you say, it depends on where they're coming from. But you also go, well, it's a bit deflating sometimes. But I think
it is difficult. But you got to deliver the tough messages, and the tough messages come with kickback, right? It's always going to be the case, and so you've got to develop a resilience around that, and you've got to. That's the role of leadership. Heavy is the head that wears a crown. You've got to make tough calls, and some people won't like it, and that's just the way it is.
Some people think they want to do it, and when they get there, they don't want to do it.
I'm one of those. I wake up every morning and go,
I don't really want to do this anymore.
I must say that this point around your sort of existential development, your development as a person, was a really big theme in my development from the days when I was at Worksman's to now. Is that because of the way in which many of the cultures of the big firms are set up, and when we talk about the tram lines, you're sort of compelled to behave in a particular way. And so what that means is that when you get up and you go to work in the morning, you put on your armor, right? So you put your shield and your armor on, and you're off to war. Then you get home and you take it all off, and you're this like soft undershell, and you try and recover from the day, and you're your own person. And so you're constantly changing these.
Just don't open the whiskey because that's a slippery slope.
Exactly. But you have a persona. Let's call it a work persona.
Yeah.
And actually changing those work personas on and off and on and off. And so when the phone rings on the weekend, it's drama because you don't have the persona on, right? And so that anxiety that you feel is deeply unsettling. And so it's been a very conscious project of mine to integrate those two places. And so the person you meet now is a person, if you came to my house for a bride, same guy. At the office, pretty much the same guy. So that when I have to work on the weekends, or I have to take phone calls, or do stuff, or do personal things during the week, I can seamlessly transition between these roles.
This is really important. This is really, really important. And it's the message that a lot of people need to hear. For someone as established as you, managing partner of the South African office of an international brand, you are at the top of the tree. And it's so important to know that for people listening, that is a deliberate choice. That is something that you've had to work on. Because I had to do the same thing. I talk about Hong Kong and not being in the tram lines. When I moved here, I finally found I could be myself. But the first couple of years, I still had the guards up. I still thought I had to be in the tram lines.
Yeah.
And once I let go of that and went, I'm going to be myself. And like you say, I'm the same guy sitting here with you on this camera than I am last night when I was reading my son a story to go to bed.
100%. And that's we talk about authenticity in leadership, right? You can't be a leader only between sort of 8 and 6, and then go home and be something else. Like, I understand we all got roles, but it's actually, you're still the same person, and you've got to find a way to integrate, to weave those together so that the person who you are, wherever you are, is capable of dealing with that situation. And so a big part of that is, we talk about the self-expression, and this is why it's so key to the culture that we're trying to build, is that you must have the ability to be able to express yourself in the way you see fit, within reason. So, like, within...
such a lawyer answer. Within reason.
Well,
it depends on what that expression is.
I'll give you a good example. Like, we dress very casually at the office, much like, you're dressed, I'm dressed, I've got sneakers on. And everyone tends to dress the way they feel comfortable. But when we've got a big meeting, or for example, on Friday, I spoke at a conference. So, I wear a suit. Yeah. You got to show up for the events, at the standards which are expected. But the day-to-day expression of yourself needs some level of liberation and freedom. And when you're in the office, obviously there's a certain level of decorum. There's probably some hierarchy of some level. Ours is pretty flat. We all just sort of get on, and there's no like line of reporting. But it's important that everyone feels that they're part of the machine, right? And so and everyone's got their own unique story. Everyone comes with something else. And
No, I talked about this with someone probably about a year ago, and I'm going to butcher what she said, but it was along those lines. It was a bit like when you've got an employer, you know, if you really want me to be here and to be myself, then I have to be myself. Like and there's a lot of big corporate spaces. This particular woman worked at a bank, and it was like, well, I can't be myself. I have to be corporate, Rob.
yeah,
And it's like, well, that's not me. So it's a difficult one. That
I'll share an anecdotal story with you, which I think is such a cool story, and it's something that sits quite close to my heart. Many years ago, maybe, I don't know, 14 years ago, I decided to take a short sabbatical and go hike in the Himalayas.
Lovely.
And my long-suffering wife said she didn't think it was a great idea. And I said to her, well, I can either go with your approval or without your approval. It's going to be much tougher if I do it without your approval. So maybe it's easier for all of us if you just gave me the nod.
Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be away for a year.
Yeah. To her credit, she supported me, and it was a really difficult time for me personally, because I needed time to think about some of the things I wanted to do. And I had this really incredible experience where I was on the Annapurna. I was in the Annapurna Sanctuary, going up towards the base camp, and there was a huge storm coming up the hill, up the glacier. And so we took shelter in a small tea house, which basically is a homestead where you can rent a mattress and buy a plate of food, you know. Mm. And we were sort of stuck inside there for the night, and the storm was battering the little shack that we were in. And the old gentleman who owned the house, couldn't speak much English. It was a bit broken, but I had a Sherpa who was interpreting, and the conversation went something like this. He said, what do you do for a living? So I said, I'm a lawyer. He goes, well, what does a lawyer do? I said, we help people navigate the rules of the community, you know. He goes, oh, that's interesting. He goes, do you like what you do? I said, I don't. I think I'm one out. I think I'm done, you know. And he said to me, are you sure you want out? Have you thought about this? I said, yeah, no, I'm very unhappy. He goes, sometimes it's not a case of, changing everything. Sometimes it's just a small change. You just need to tweak a small thing. And he said, you need to understand what your apples are. And I listened to what he said, and I thought, well, that's a bizarre statement. I'm not sure I understand that. And in fact, in the translation, it came out a bit sort of muddled to say, what fruit are you producing? But I realized a few days later while I was walking, sort of the penny dropped for me. And the message was this: an apple tree produces apples effortlessly and abundantly, because that's what an apple tree does, right? It just pushes out apples. It doesn't have to wake up in the morning and think about, should I do it? It's so hard, push out an apple. It just pushes out apples, right? Because that's what apple trees do. But if you asked it to put out an orange, it's going to go through trauma, right? It's not going to be able to do it. It's going to have existential problems. It's going to ask questions of itself, imposter syndrome.
And then it'll fail.
And it's a traumatized existence. And I realized, it was then that I realized that I could have been the CEO of Anglo. I could have been a landscaper, a teacher, an engineer, a doctor. I could have been anything. But the one thing would have been the same for me, regardless of where I was, and that's I would have been seeking to mentor and train people. Those were my apples. And so in that day, in what was probably, somewhere in the back end of the Himalayas, I took a decision that it just so happened I was a lawyer. Right? But my focus, my purpose in life was to train and mentor people. And so once I took it on board, and I understood that those were my apples, then everything changed for me, because it wasn't difficult then. It wasn't difficult.
Amazing.
And it just so happened that we did law.
Yeah. And you still do now.
And I still do now. Yeah. And my love for the law came back, my love for doing law came back, because there was something basic and universal about it for me that made so much sense. So this is what I do. And so when I sit with the youngsters, juniors, and I train them, and I talk about the law, and we debate things, and we draft, and I comment on their work. Not only are we servicing the client, but I'm feeding a most fundamental expression of myself, and that makes it all worthwhile. So when I wake up in the morning, okay, granted, some days are tougher than others, but when I wake up in the morning, for the most part, it's an exciting day, because I get to push out apples, and I'm an apple tree in an apple orchard, and so young lawyers who find themselves in big firms are like apple trees pushing out oranges. It's hard for them because they haven't worked out what their thing is, and their thing and it doesn't have to be it's law or it's medicine or it's engineering. It has to be something a little bit more universal about who they are as people, and that will inform the role they take in that space. So identifying people's true strengths is where I think the answer lies. And that's why when we talk about building out culture, for me, it's about getting people who understand and know themselves, people with a particular level of character, have been through life experiences, because we'll be able to work out where they're best fitted, and we'll move them into that space, over time, and hopefully get the best out of them and longer term sustainable sort of participation in the firm. Otherwise they just become cogs, badly suited for a job.
That is really, well, thank you for that, because that actually tells the listeners a lot more about you and your approach, and that's the whole point of the Legal Unicorns podcast, is to find people who are thinking slightly differently, and show the real people behind the law, behind the businesses of law. I don't want to, I've got a million questions to ask you, but I don't want to ask you anything else, because I want to end on that note. I think it's such a wonderful message to send anybody that's listening that is particularly interested in your journey. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Andersen's, we've had a year of, so let's take it 2 years, where you've broken away from Tabax, which is a firm that had a good name. Andersen's is now growing. It's in its second year. People are asking about what's going on. They'll phone me, what's happening there, what's going on. We've had this year where we've had quite a lot of change going on, a lot of growth in the small firms, but also then 2 of the big ones leaving. Everyone's asking what's going on at the big 5. It's a changing time, especially with AI. And it's really important that there's a lot of young lawyers out there that are looking to have good careers. And it's important that they know that people like you exist, and that you're authentically talking about what you just changed your lens. Yeah. And that was so, there's probably 1,000 partners out there that will listen to this, that will go, I start looking up Himalayan flights. They need that moment. And I've met them, and you've met them. Yeah. Where you go, I had it once, and I'll end on that. I had it once, and the names will stay out of it. But with a lawyer here who was looking for a job, they were looking to leave the big 5 that they were at. And all the reasons that person gave me, all I said was, I don't think you've fallen out of love with the law. I think you just need a different environment. And that person is now still at a law firm 5 years later, and is loving life. So it was just a change of lens. But on that, look, I love working with you guys. The team you're putting together, is dynamic. They're all different. Yeah,
we're a motley crew.
Are a lot of fun. They're genuine. The firm's going places, and it's been, thanks so much for coming in.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm so pleased to be able to share the story, some anecdotal stuff, and love working with you and your team. So thank you. You guys have done some great work for us, and really appreciate it.
Thanks, man. Cheers.
Cheers.